So, we are discussing His Holiness's book, How to Be Compassionate, and we've been looking uh, kind of in a way going just through the book sequentially, looking at the various ideas that are presented. And in this section that we were up to about chapter 8 in the material, and in this chapter and in the previous chapters that we've been talking about most recently, His Holiness has been looking at the obstacles to compassion and putting them in the context of how the mind generates those obstacles, how the mind um, creates what are called the afflictions, the delusions, and he's been discussing um, in various ways really the root of that process, which is the unfortunate reality that mind, ordinary mind, arises with or co emerges with what's called fundamental ignorance or marigpa. And um, it's one of, in the many lists of Buddhism, it's in the list of the three root delusions, together with hatred and attachment or lust or attachment, however you want to phrase it, sometimes called anger and attachment, sometimes called hatred and attachment, sometimes called hatred and lust. But you get the idea, the three root delusions. But really, what His Holiness is pointing out, and what is pointed out in other ways, is that even hatred and lust or attachment, they spring from fundamental ignorance. So this list of three, they're not really co-equal, because even the other two are rooted in fundamental ignorance. We can get rid of, if we were, let's say, to completely get rid of hatred, um, in a manifest way, we would still, Buddhism would suggest that, we would still, even if we were incredibly familiar with love, with compassion, with all of the conventional antidotes, and in a manifest way, we really never gave rise to strong feelings of aversion. Um, the latencies would still be there. The subtle stains of that would still be there, because we haven't addressed fundamental ignorance. When we address fundamental ignorance, then not only do we subsequently address hatred and attachment, but we also address jealousy and any kind of ill will, any kind of uh, covetousness, or, so you can see how the secondary and tertiary negative mental states are combinations of fundamental ignorance, attachment, and hatred. These three, when they're combined in various ways, they get things like jealousy and ill will and covetousness and all of the other things that we need to be concerned about. But of those three, really, the essence of the Buddhist path is overcoming fundamental ignorance. Uh, and yet, that's not the only thing that the Buddha taught. That's not like the Buddha said, only do this one thing. The Buddha said that if you and when you do this one thing, then you've now succeeded at eliminating completely all of the primary, secondary, tertiary, quadrary, all of the delusions, all of the afflictions all at once, whatever is remaining. But it's also true that there are many methods that may be more effective in the moment, because we may not yet have deeply familiarized the mind with all of the subtle philosophical aspects that of wisdom that overcome fundamental ignorance, but perhaps we can recollect the kindness of that person. Like if anger is arising in the mind, it might be too difficult to, in that moment, to reflect on the nature of the self, the nature of the other person, in that fundamental way. But if we have done a number of meditations recollecting the kindness of sentient beings, maybe we can think about that in that moment. And maybe that will, or if we've done a number of meditations on the disadvantages of giving in to the impulse, the angry impulse, then maybe we don't overcome anger in a fundamental way, but we're able to restrain in the moment. We're able to avoid escalating the situation with screaming, with throwing things, with saying, a biting, unkind, wounding kind of response, even just due to the force of familiarity with the disadvantages of anger. Um, or like I said, the positive things like many meditations on love, compassion, etc. So there are conventional antidotes, and then there's sort of the ultimate antidote. And the ultimate antidote is sort of what His Holiness is focusing in on in this section, where, so what we've talked about is that reality has two levels to it. There's conventional reality and ultimate reality, two sides of the same coin, two ways of looking at it. And it's not as though they're two different things. It's really two ways of understanding, sort of two ways that our mind can make sense of reality. The easy way to make sense of reality is conventional reality, the way that we make sense of things when we're just kind of when we're just sort of in daily life. Um, we're not analyzing, we're not really being introspective, we're just kind of reacting to what's happening. Then really conventional reality, the reality of appearances, is how we're making sense of what we're dealing with. The more difficult way of making sense of it is through analysis, is through introspective awareness, is through trying to go beyond appearances, trying to see the deeper nature of reality. That deeper nature, it was there when we were caught up in the world of appearances, um, but we weren't using that lens. We weren't using that part because we were too busy. The mind was too caught up. We were too reactive. We didn't have the spaciousness that we needed. So that's one reason why it's much easier to try to do that at first in meditation rather than in daily life. That's, once we become familiar with what that analysis is, we, generally speaking, have an easier time applying it in quiet sessions of meditation when things aren't actually, when we're maybe remembering what happened. We're not actually called to respond in a time sensitive way, we can be more introspective. Um, and then by doing it in those, just like with anything, and that's true, that's why meditation exists. It gives us a, a process to become familiar with things separate from the stress of needing to react in the moment. And that's true of compassion. When we become more and more familiar with any of these things, they're all going to be easier in meditation. And then hopefully the idea is that doing many sessions of meditation, we become so familiar, then it bleeds over into daily life, that we can call upon that familiarity when things are happening, when the mind is stressed and anxious and all of that. But we use meditation as the vehicle for creating that familiarity, rather than just expecting ourselves to be able to read about it and then try to do it only when we're driving or when someone's yelling, when there's so much going on and the mind is kind of overwhelmed. So, what he um, is suggesting here is that we try to cultivate that introspective state, that state where we question appearances, where we question, we interrogate, the reality of appearances, the reality that appears to the mind when we're not being skillful at analyzing. Um, he says, as you cultivate this insight, it will naturally become stronger and stronger, and you'll find yourself less and less susceptible to counterproductive emotions. He says, now you allow yourself to notice the deeper continuum that usually goes unnoticed and cultivate true concern for others. You refuse to voluntarily rush into what are actually superficial responses to exaggerated appearances and take time to probe what lies underneath the surface. So, we were talking in the previous classes about how the fact that as an ordinary sentient being, which just means not yet enlightened, our mind, because it arose or arises simultaneous with fundamental ignorance, then the world of appearances takes on an exaggerated quality, an unrealistic, exaggerated quality comes along with this world of appearances, which means that when we observe something that we would describe as pleasant, or when that's something that we would describe as unpleasant, we don't have a balanced, reasonable relationship to those objects. We deeply crave the pleasant objects and we deeply wish to be separated from the unpleasant objects. We have no capacity to tolerate anything other than that. We feel as though our peace of mind, our happiness is dependent upon being able to remain in contact with pleasant objects and being able to remain distant from unpleasant objects. And the trouble is, of course, that our ability to follow through on that is rather limited. Um, it's more it's more capable for people like us than it is for 98% of the rest of the world. Because but still, even still, it's still quite limited. We don't control whether we get sick. We don't control whether other people get sick. We don't control that we age. We don't control what happens in society in general, changes in the economy, changes in, so these broad kinds of, it is true that um, we can probably bring pleasant things in and remove pleasant things more effectively than almost anyone. But still, there's much of that that lies outside of our control. And Buddhism would say, even if we feel confident in the level that we have, and we kind of feel like, okay, I have this pretty good, relatively speaking, pretty good control over that. And so I'm just going to be content with that. We try to develop a contentment with what we can or cannot control. If we go through life still with the perspective that we should put most of our time and most of our effort into that control aspect, Buddhism would suggest that's still a waste of our broader potential, that we're still going to die. Um, and being content with that is a lost opportunity for something greater, because we will chase that exaggerated world of appearances for however much longer we're alive, and then we'll die. And then what? Buddhism would say that that's not the end. Body and mind separate. Mind takes a different form. That new body and mind have another lifetime, and then another death, and then that process just repeats. And that's samsara. That's the cycle of birth and death that ordinary sentient beings are experiencing. Um, and the only alternative to that is the enlightened state, either lower nirvana or the state of full enlightenment. But those are the only options, um, other than ordinary existence, samsaric existence. And so, given that choice, it makes more sense to use our time to try to move in the direction, Mahayana Buddhism would say, a full enlightenment, rather than developing a sense of contentment with, this is what I can control, this is what I can't control. So I'm really just going to try to do all of the controlling that I can and just be happy with that. Buddhism would say to move beyond that and recognize that those objects themselves are not really worth controlling, that it isn't worth spending an inordinate amount of time learning to bring in as much positivity as we can and push out as much negativity as we can, because that whole process is giving into a very surface level, mistaken view of reality, where we could instead be developing a penetrative insight into that deeper level of reality, and seeing that the whole process of feeling as though our happiness depends upon pulling and pushing is incorrect, that it's a way of thinking, it's a way of perceiving, and we're free to stay in that mode, as most people do, but that if we go into that deeper mode, then full enlightenment opens up. Then we can actually transcend this cycle of clinging and grasping, pushing and pulling, that keeps us stuck, that is what is responsible for, because we are going to die. And when we die, are we going to be free of that impulse that grasps at the known, the comfortable, the pleasant? Or is that impulse going to arise again during the death process and thereby activate another karma in the mind that generates yet another rebirth? From the Buddhist perspective, that's those are the roads. That's the question. It isn't that one is right or wrong. It's just there's door number one and door number two. And door number two, if that's enlightenment, if that's the enlightenment door, the Buddha said, well, that's better. That's preferable. And so, just from a practical perspective, from a suffering, from the idea that suffering is not good, and the kind of suffering that we think that we're transcending by getting really good at pushing and pulling is an insignificant level of suffering compared to the deeper levels of suffering that we're doing nothing to address by getting really good at that. And so it's just not worth our time to get really good at that. It is worth our time to see through all of that and do something really meaningful. That's what His Holiness is trying to encourage us to do with the section that we're in now. Any thoughts or questions so far? Yeah, so the observation that was made is um, that we have to balance the fact that we, living in the world, and we have to balance um, the conventional reality with the ultimate reality. Um, but I don't know. I don't know that Buddhism. So when you say go too far, so Buddhism would certainly caution us against going too far, getting caught up in the world of appearances. But are you thinking, is something arising that you feel that if a person really analyzes things, then, and they go in that direction, do you see a disadvantage or a? Mhm. Right. So yes. So the observation is that when we are looking at objects, we, as I was saying, like through this you're kind of talking about exaggeration, where we might get caught up in just thinking about things in a pleasure and pain dynamic, and so we might spiral in one direction or another. But so maybe we need to then go in a little bit more detail about what His Holiness is actually encouraging, like what is the actual analysis that because His Holiness would agree that that dynamic, looking at the world through those, thinking that only those two baskets are the only ways in which we should look at experiences or objects or relationships, or that's not what His Holiness is encouraging. Um, but this deeper level that His Holiness is encouraging is, we kind of addressed it in some previous classes um, too, uh, but it's to recognize that either of those perceptions, that regardless of which perception is arising, that we're making a mistake when that perception is arising, regardless of whether it's a perception of pain or a perception of pleasure. The person who is ex- perceiving in that way, if they're an ordinary sentient being, then almost certainly they're making the mistake of believing that that perception is something that is residing in what is being perceived external to oneself. Um, and that's the deeper level of analysis, really, that His Holiness is encouraging us to look at. Um, it's really reflecting on the nature of perception. Um, that's kind of what, so this topic in Buddhism is called the wisdom. You could say the wisdom of reality. You could say the wisdom of what's called emptiness, um, the ultimate nature of things. And really, what that is, it's becoming aware of how perception works and the mistakes that arise in any given act of perception that occur to an ordinary sentient being. So all we're really trying to do, and of course I say all, but it's the most difficult thing that anyone can do, is to directly realize the nature of reality in a non-conceptual direct way. But what we're trying to do is recognize that it doesn't matter what is appearing, um, whether it's whether it's aversive, whether it's pleasant, whether it seems pretty neutral, like just like, oh, that's a chair. We might look at it and say, oh, it might kind of looks uncomfortable, but so maybe it's a little aversive, but or like a pencil, like nobody, if you have a pencil, all pencils are the same. Nobody has like an emotional reaction to a pencil. So you're just like, oh, that's a pencil. Um, but the mistake that we make, even with a pencil, is that we think that the pencil was there in the room that was closed, and we were in the, and we opened the door and the pencil's on the table, and we think the pencil was there before we perceived it. We think that the pencil has some essence, has some like unique pencil nature, um, and that what it's doing is it's broadcasting its pencil essence to us, and we're helpless but to perceive its intrinsic essence of pencilness that's over there separate from me. And so we take no responsibility for our active perception, which Buddhism would say is very active. It's not passive. It's a very, very active thing that we're bringing all of our culture, all of our language, all of our past experiences, everything that we've learned. We're bringing that to every act of perception, even all of the thousands of individual things that we're being bombarded with just in this room, that colors, shapes, definitions, all of that is active, that we are bringing basically just about everything to, because even our biology we're bringing to it, like the way that our eyes work, the way that our ears work. If our eyes or ears worked differently, we would perceive a different spectrum of electromagnetic radiation. We would perceive a different spectrum of auditory stimulus. We would perceive, a different, or if we had different kinds of touch receptors, we would perceive, or pain receptor. There's nothing real um, about how our biology uniquely reacts with the environment. That's just how humans. So it's real for all humans, maybe, but that's not special. That doesn't tell you anything about reality other than most humans have a similar biology that reacts to the environment in a similar way. And so we have a shared language that arises from that. We have a shared agreement that arises from our shared biology. But if our biology was different, we'd have a completely different shared, which means that there's nothing about the environment, there's nothing about what's there that's that is informing that shared language, that shared experience. It's just shared biology. Um, and so if the biology, if a change in the biology can result in a change in the perception, then the perception's very active. It's not passive. But we are not good, as I was, going back to a little earlier in the class, the world of appearances is the world that appears to the unintrospective mind, the busy mind, the mind that's not doing that kind of deep analysis. So that world is, oh, this is pleasant, this is unpleasant, this is, I enjoy this, I don't enjoy this, I want more of this, I want less of this, um, rather than trying to go deeper and recognize that there is nothing there in the object that is pleasant from the side of the object, that there are, I mean, things exist, but they don't exist in the way that we perceive them to exist. They don't have the same concrete, independent existence that we ascribe them to have. Um, and that, as I was saying, that's easier when we're trying to do that in meditation, because we can just kind of spend time and kind of go slow and create the spacious kind of mental conditions to see that. But then we go out into the world, and then we're bombarded with sights and smells and sounds, and we get overwhelmed, and we start to make shortcuts in our perceptions, um, and then the world of appearances kind of takes over. So bringing that wisdom, that introspective awareness into daily life is what His Holiness is encouraging us to do, by recognizing that we're not helpless, passive observers of reality. We're actively creating the reality that we experience in each moment. And then, therefore, by changing the mind that's doing the perception, we change how we perceive. Um, you know, so I mean, an example of that would be, um, if we're not yet deeply familiar with the way of perceiving sentient beings, because I've alluded to in the um, motivation, alluded to the beginningless and endless nature of the mind that Buddhism asserts is true. If that's true, Buddhism then further suggests that all sentient beings have um, literally been one's own mother countless times in previous lives, because um, the understanding is that if the mind is truly beginningless, and if sentient beings if the number of sentient beings is not quite fully truly mathematically infinite, which seems to be, I mean, I don't know, but that's kind of seems to be the way that it's presented. Like there's a huge number of sentient beings, but it's not presented as like truly actually infinite. Um, because if it was, then I mean, if there's two infinities, then maybe you can't say that they've actually matched up in that way because it's truly actually infinite. But if it's something less than truly infinite, then but still an inconceivable number, but still given an inconceivable number and given infinity, then when those two things are matched up, then it follows that because many sentient beings have mothers, that countless times every sentient being has played that role for every other sentient being. So if we get really good at thinking in that way, then every time we see a sentient being, that wisdom can arise in the mind. That wisdom that identifies that as a sentient being that has played the role of one's own mother can naturally arise in the mind, which transforms the way that we would naturally relate. It transforms, our willingness to help others. It transforms our the kind of patience, because we have more patience with people that we feel close to. We're more likely to be generous, more likely to be kind. Just on a conventional level, that's just kind of how reciprocity is kind of a way that we perceive. And so um, all of those things become more likely when we can perceive in that way. I don't remember where I was going with that. But, so, in the same way, when we can recognize that every act of perception that we're engaging in is active, then we, as His Holiness is saying, we can get more spaciousness in the mind. We don't get so caught up in the way that things appear because we recognize, well, sure, that chocolate cake, it seems like it's delicious from its own side, but really that's just because I grew up in a particular culture at a particular time. I had chocolate cake many times as I was growing up. I I was given it as a treat, so it was presented to me in a particular context, whereas like, other things were presented to me in a different context. And so I learned that this was a dessert, this was a special treat. Um, and it wasn't like a punishment. It wasn't like go to your room and eat some chocolate, because probably if that had happened, we'd probably get averse to chocolate cake. Like if our parents said, go to your room, you're grounded, you have to eat this whole chocolate cake, 30 years later we'd probably hate chocolate cake, right? Because that context would be different. um, but whereas like vegetables and things like those were presented as like, oh, you have to eat your vegetables, you have to finish your, so that was a different context that we learned. So we might have actually trouble like liking vegetables because we thought they were kind of a punishment, growing up. Like, but chocolate cake was this sort of elusive, wonderful thing that only happened sometimes. Um, and so we it has a particular cognitive context that informs how we relate to it. And that has nothing to do with the object. It has nothing, it's just how it was presented, how we internalized it, and now how we relate to it. And Buddhism would say we're not relating to things reasonably in a balanced way due to that exaggeration that happens. And the more we can investigate the nature of that chocolate cake and recognize that it's not broadcasting deliciousness to us. It doesn't have a true, definable, findable essence um, because also it causes heart disease and diabetes. And if it was truly made out of happiness as it appears, then we could just, first of all sentient beings would think of it that way, regardless of their culture, regardless of how they were, because it's broadcasting its essence. If it's true that we're helpless observers of reality, then that means that all humans would have to relate to all things in exactly the same way, because that's the nature of the object, and we're just passively noticing it. But even with chocolate cake, there are people who can take it or leave it. Like it's not like, they don't, it's not what they prefer. Um, so there's nothing there that's truly being broadcast to all sentient beings from the side of the object. We're actively creating a relationship with that object. And so taking responsibility for that process and recognizing that we're bringing almost everything to it. Now, of course, if someone says that chocolate cake is, sour, or, you know, that it tastes like um, asparagus or something, then there's something like biologically odd about. So again, we can talk about like a shared normal range of, we all kind of agree that it tastes sort of like this, but our description of it as pleasant or unpleasant, that's entirely personal. Um, there's nothing from, so it isn't to say that anything can be anything. Things certainly have qualities, um, but the solidity of that, our kind of self-assured confidence that it really is out there, it really is separate from me, and I'm just receiving information about it in a very valid way, is not true. Buddhism would say that's a false kind of confidence that we have about our acts of perception. Yes, Kodo, you have a question.
Um, I really appreciate what you're saying, and I see it here in the book on page 68. His Holiness says that the basic consciousness, the fundamental inborn mind of clear light,
Hmm.
and then because it makes transformation possible, we're not stuck in our afflictive emotions. And it's also called the
Hmm.
inner nature of enlightenment. And then the next page in big letters, he says, afflictive emotions are based on a mistake. And then he goes on and on and on. And that's what you're talking
Hmm.
about, is the mistake of thinking that cake is inevitably real.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
it
so that's
makes
kind of the
emptiness
next.
even more important.
Yeah, that's kind of
Thank
the
you.
next chapter where His Holiness is introducing the the good news about all of this, um, which is that um, even though it's true, so maybe we can circle back if we need to, but we could also maybe just go on to the next chapter, which is called the malleable nature of the mind, chapter 9. The good news, because that's all kind of like depressing, right? Like that fundamental ignorance co-arises with ordinary mind, and which is why you don't find any ordinary sentient beings who don't misperceive in this way. Like there's no one who's just like born, there's no humans that are just like randomly born and they don't do this. Like this, it isn't that there's something wrong with just me, or it's some kind of flaw in the Western. But every sentient being, their mind co-arises with fundamental ignorance. But the important distinction of co-arises means, arises together with, but to arising together with doesn't mean that they are the same. It doesn't mean that the mind is in the nature of fundamental ignorance. The mind arises simultaneous with fundamental ignorance if the mind is still ordinary, but fundamental ignorance is removable from the mind while leaving the mind itself intact. While, because as Kodo was saying, His Holiness in chapter 9 describes the nature of the mind simply as being that which is clear and knowing, um, or that which possesses clarity and awareness. And clarity doesn't mean uh, like free from, because we might think that clarity means um, perfect or free from obscuration. Clarity is a technical word that means formless and shapeless and kind of like an energetic. It kind of just means it's an energy that doesn't have definable shape or size. And then awareness also doesn't mean perfectly aware or aware without mistake. It just means that some kind of internal representation is developed when the mind is directed toward an object. Um, but those are the only two characteristics of mind. Mind itself is an energy that develops an awareness when that energy is directed toward an object. And that's mediated for us in this life, that's mediated through the senses. So it's mediated through the eyes, the ears, because we're embodied in this, for the duration of this existence, we are an embodied being. Our mind and our body are together. And so that act of awareness is mediated through our eyes, our ears. So, of course, then we're subject to deficiencies of, I can't see anymore. I need like readers. I can't, and that wasn't always true. I had good vision and now I can't. I think the pandemic has ruined my eyesight. I don't screens for 3 years. I can't read anything anymore. Um, which doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with my mind, but my ability to perceive visually is mediated through the eyeball, the eye sense power, the eye sense consciousness. So, so defects in that, of course, will impact how we perceive. But even though the mind and ignorance are arising together, we can grow our wisdom and then use our wisdom to uproot that fundamental ignorance and then leave mind as it is, as clear and knowing, but now clear and knowing free from any of the afflicted states, because fundamental ignorance was responsible for all of the afflicted states, because they're all based on exaggeration. They're all based on actively misperceiving, actively misunderstanding what we are perceiving, what we're in relation to. And so now you just have mind free from affliction, and that's enlightenment. That's what we're trying to do. The mind, but the process of achieving enlightenment isn't the process of adding something to the mind, except for knowledge, except for, you know, creating new familiarities, certainly, but not anything, fundamental, not anything. The, the mind itself, free from affliction, is enlightened mind. It is simply the fact that for whatever reason, fundamental ignorance and mind are co-arising, that is the problem. But again, we can develop and strengthen the wisdom mind and then use the wisdom mind to uproot the part of the mind that is influenced by fundamental ignorance. And then there is mind itself, and mind itself is enlightened mind, is what the goal is. So we're not really adding some new, we don't need to change mind. We just need to remove the fundamental ignorance that is part of what sentient beings naturally are experiencing. Um, and then that's it. Then the mind is enlightened mind. Ordinary mind transforms into enlightened mind. An enlightened mind does not take rebirth after rebirth after rebirth in the kinds of experiences, the kinds of realms, the kinds of environments that ordinary mind does. Um, Enlightened mind exists separate from that process, and therefore, enlightened mind is not experiencing any of the disadvantages of ordinary existence. And enlightened mind can do things like emanate back into cyclic existence for the benefit of the beings who are present in cyclic existence. Like His Holiness is said to be an emanation of enlightened mind. So that enlightened mind is separate from ordinary existence, but due to great love and great compassion for sentient beings, that enlightened mind created an emanation in order to interact with us, because we can't interact with that mind. That mind kind of came down to us and created a form through which that enlightened mind can work for our benefit and through which we can be benefited, um, but is still separate from the ordinary process that we are stuck in. So it's, again, it's just considered to be better. Of the two options, one is just considered to be better than the other. Yeah, and so that is what, as Kodo was saying, His Holiness points out that that is what makes enlightenment possible. That's why we are not just stuck. You have the four noble truths. The first noble truth is, the truth of unsatisfactory conditions, which is traceable to fundamental ignorance. And that's like the most depressing part of it, is that things are that way. But then it gets you get better and better as you go through the four noble truths, and you end up with the way out. You end up with understanding that there's a specific reason, again, which is fundamental ignorance. And then there are antidotes, there are specific things that can be done that uproot fundamental ignorance from the mind. And that's the very hopeful message of Buddhism, is that, it isn't just like the Buddha observed that everything is difficult and that's it. The Buddha observed that, yes, things are difficult and there are these disadvantages, but it's not random, it's not causeless, it's not something that we're stuck with. It's very scientific in a way. It can be very clearly understood, and very precise antidotes can be employed to change that situation. And then we can follow in the footsteps of the Buddha and achieve that same result and free the mind from ignorance. And then we ourselves become like the Buddha. We ourselves become fully enlightened. And His Holiness says that we have everything, we already have everything that we need. We have the necessary seeds in the mind of love, of compassion, of wisdom, of patience, of, we're familiar to some maybe smaller degree, but those are not foreign things. We just have to grow those seeds. We have to nourish those seeds. We have some wisdom. We have some love. We have some compassion. If we were completely devoid of one of those, then I mean, how do you implant something that doesn't exist at all? You can't. Um, but if you have a tiny amount of it, then you can grow it, then you can nourish it, and then it can become greater and greater over time. And we don't lack any of those things. We don't lack the necessary intelligence or wisdom or compassion. It's just a question of cultivating it to the point where it overwhelms the parts of the mind that are not so helpful, that are not constructive. Yeah, and so he gives the pretty clear example of the fact that um, if it were true that these negative states of mind were intrinsic to the mind, then we would always be experiencing them. We would, if anger was truly inherent to the mind, then we would always be angry. Um, but we're not always angry. We only become angry when certain causes and conditions come together. Certain, we start to, the mind interacts with a certain combination of, so there's mind, there's external factors, and they're all coming together to give rise to a temporary experience of hatred or lust or whatever it might be. But then those causes and conditions change, and then that subsides. That anger, whatever it is, it's there maybe intensely for some period of time, but it will naturally subside. You know, we'll fall asleep, or we'll get distracted, or somebody else will come. I mean, something will happen where those causes and those conditions cease, and then that strong experience goes back into the background, and something else arises. Then boredom arises, or a positive state arises. But the one thing that is happening is awareness, is clarity and awareness that is always present. you know so that's why His Holiness encourages us to separate, to actively try to think in a way that separates the arising of these states of mind from how we think about the mind. And what I mean by that is, instead of thinking, I am angry, we try to think anger is arising in the mind, um, to create that sense of distance. So, because that's a more accurate way of thinking. That's a more valid way of describing the situation. There's a coming together of causes. But of course, it feels subjectively. I mean, the reason that we say I am angry is because it subjectively it's intense, and we don't really feel a sense of separation from the experience. It is as if there is only anger in the mind in that moment. But if we can see it, and so, that's why we would say, I am my anger in that moment. But the I is so much more than that. It's more valid to say that's just the particular cloud that's arising in them, and then it's dissipating and passing away, and it's going to be replaced with something else. Um, so not, if we can learn to create that sense of separation, that sense of spaciousness around the anger, even just by talking about it differently, then we can diminish the power that we give it, instead of thinking, that I am one with that state. We just think, well, this is something that is occurring in the stage of my mind, but that the stage of my mind is incredibly vast. And this is just a temporary appearance in the mind at this moment. Um, and then we can start to use that to be more balanced and realistic about that. And then he points out another kind of tool that he points out, which underlies meditation, and underlies, this idea of antidotes, which is that the mind can't cognize the same object in opposing ways at the same moment. It can cognize the same object in opposing ways at different points in time. We can look at one sentient being, one other person, and at two different points in time, we can feel great love toward them, or we can feel great animosity toward them. Um, but we can't feel great love and great animosity toward the same sentient being in exactly the same moment. We can go back and forth, you know, in a relatively short period of time, but not in the exact same moment. So the more familiar, the more moments that we can have of that beneficial, constructive way of relating, then necessarily, by definition, we're having fewer moments of that afflictive way of relating. And if that constructive way of relating can become kind of our baseline state, then it will be very difficult to give rise to that afflicted way of relating. It'll become more and more difficult, um, because, like, going back to that example of seeing all sentient beings as having been one's mother, if we could internalize that to an incredibly deep level, then every time we see any sentient, then that is the impression that we'll get. Not, oh, that's my neighbor, or oh, that's a cab driver that I've never spoken to, or oh, that's my accountant. No, all of those, they will all be kind mother sentient beings. And that's the appearance that will be most present in the mind. Um, And so that's how we will treat them. That's how we will react to them, is through that particular lens, not the lens of, oh, I'm close to this person, but I'm not close to that person, or, oh, that person owes me money, so I'm going to relate to them through that lens and not this lens. We're relating to them through the most constructive lens that we can, the best way, because, it's also valid, but just like our own mother, it's also valid that that person is, an attorney and, whatever, all of these other, but we're kind of picking the most beneficial story to tell ourselves, the most impactful, useful, constructive lens through which to see that person. And and then if that is what is strongly arising, then that will reduce any kind of it then we'll have maybe an unkind thought, or but then we go back to, well, but in all of those past lives, that person was willing to give up their body. That person was willing to undergo great hardship. That person was, fed me from their own body. And so, I mean, yeah, okay, they owe me money, but they did, countless times. And so it kind of doesn't matter. It pales, just like if our own mother is having a bad day, or, and is cross, we're going to be like, well, but that's just a drop in the bucket compared to what all of these other things that I can. And so it doesn't matter as much. But without that lens, then it becomes more ego based, and it becomes, well, what did they do for me today? What did they do for me yesterday? And not, you know, this incredibly vast lifetime after lifetime of benefit that we can be perceiving them through. So that would be, His Holiness talks. So what this is getting at then is that this whole process is is replacing a wrong consciousness with a right consciousness. It's about, because the delusions, in order for the delusions to exist, as Holiness points out, there must be a mistake. We must exaggerate. We must, um, not take any responsibility for the active nature of our perception. But for that mistake, the afflictions can't arise. They depend upon that mistake for their existence. And so if we can just be like, oh yeah, that's not true, it's we're not replacing something else, this idea of emptiness, which is kind of, what he's discussing here. It's what's called a non-affirming negation. The wisdom realizing emptiness is a non-affirming negation. So all we're trying to do is realize that things don't exist in this mistaken way that they appear to exist, that the concrete, independent reality that we ascribe to things is a mistake. We don't have to then say, and this is true. We're not putting something else in place of that. We're not affirming. Seeing through that mistake doesn't then imply that something else is definitely. So it's sort of a groundlessness, is kind of how all we're left with then is, that all kinds of sentient beings relate to that in different ways. And that's all valid. If a hell being, they give the example of water, and they talk about how water appears to different kinds of sentient beings. So for humans, it appears as water. For the gods that they talk about, the upper realms, the deva, they say that, and that's, in English, it's not my favorite, but, because we have from Judeo-Christian, it's not great, but that's the English word that they chose for the upper realm, the god, and, god and demigod realms, they say that water appears like a incredibly blissful kind of nectar, a celestial sort of ambrosia kind of nectar. Whereas for the hell beings, it appears as like dirt and pus and like, this sort of disgusting, foul. But it's the same object, um, but seen through the lens of different sentient beings. And that's kind of all we're saying, is that all sentient beings are actively mis and so it isn't to say that water is actually ambrosia, or water is actually water, or water is, and that one perception is true and these other ones are false. They're all false, but they're all valid for the sentient being engaged in that active perception. For a human, all humans are going to see water as water, and that's a valid, conventionally speaking, that's valid for that sentient being. And for a god, it's valid that all gods perceive it as ambrosia, as this, um, and it's also valid that humans don't, and it's valid that gods don't see it, and that's what emptiness is. It's that those sentient beings are bringing their own karmic, you know, history and baggage and all of this to their own unique active perception. And that gives rise to a particular appearance. And that appearance has conventional validity for beings of a similar type, but it doesn't say anything about that object, because the same object can be seen in all of these different ways, means that, and all of those, the gods are completely convinced that it's actually really ambrosia, because if they weren't, they'd be enlightened. They wouldn't just be gods, they'd be enlightened. There's nothing better about the god realm than the human realm. I mean, in terms of ordinary versus enlightened, the gods are making the same fundamental mistake. The gods have fundamental ignorance arising in their minds, just like we do. They'd think that there's real ambrosia out there separate from them, just like we think that there's real water out there separate from us. Um, and so all we have to do, it isn't that this wisdom affirms some specific way of relating. It just negates the world of appearances. It just negates the concreteness that all sentient beings ascribe to their unique active individual perception, without then saying that there is a right way, that there is something that's really true. Because there isn't a right way. There isn't like we have to stumble upon seeing it as ambrosia and then we're free. Um, all we have to do is recognize that all ordinary sentient beings are actively misperceiving whatever their perception is. It is informed by ignorance. It is a mistaken way that no sentient being is. So ultimately, then we're left with, we don't know what water is. Like it doesn't have its own essence. Um, it has, it's not a car, it's not a airplane. We can, but so it has characteristics. It has, but it doesn't. It doesn't have one findable true essence. It can be validly perceived in a myriad of different ways, and that's what emptiness would. That's what the wisdom of emptiness would suggest. And so then by extension, the positive states of mind, like love and compassion, these are valid states of mind because love is the wish for oneself and all sentient beings to have happiness and the causes of happiness. Compassion is the wish for oneself and all sentient beings to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. And so there's no mistake there. There's no misperception. There's no exaggeration. Um, these states of mind can arise and do arise without ignorance. They arise because you're seeing suffering and you're wishing for it to cease. There's nothing, that's a valid mind. It is a mind that, um, now, of course, we have to understand that suffering, the suffering that that sentient being is experiencing, is not as solid as it appears. But for the sentient being who's experiencing it, like they are suffering. And so, yes, if they had wisdom realizing emptiness, they wouldn't suffer. So you wish for them to have realizing, you wish for them to develop the insight of wisdom realizing emptiness so that they don't suffer, which is the whole process of wanting to achieve enlightenment in order to help all other sentient beings achieve enlightenment so that no sentient being is suffering. Um, so those minds are able to, they don't disappear when enlightenment is achieved. An enlightened being also, now enlightened being has perfect love, perfect compassion, um, because their mind is completely free from any of the obscurations, any of the delusions, completely free of fundamental ignorance. And yet, so they have just pure awareness. Their awareness apprehends sentient beings who are experiencing suffering, sentient beings who are bereft of happiness, and simply wishes for them to have happiness, to be free of suffering. Um, and there's no exaggerated or mistaken view that's part of that process. So it's considered a completely valid mind. Any thoughts or questions? Well, so the only way that, I mean, of course, I think that on a conventional level, we learn, we 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 may suffering. Buddhism doesn't disagree with the idea that suffering presents an opportunity to learn something about things. Like that's how we learn, that we should eat every day and that we should eat, because like if we eat really terribly for like we feel bad and you know and so then we like maybe I should eat better or maybe I should exercise or so the consequence like consequences of poor decision making or we certainly gain some wisdom uh, hopefully from that, and Buddhism doesn't disagree with that. um, but the only way to be completely free of suffering is to be enlightened. So there's no like danger that we're all going to be just living here on earth with like kind of all of the other things, and we've removed that kind of learning tool from the toolbox. Like that's not possible. We're going to have suffering for as long as we remain ordinary, and the benefits of it, which there are some, um, they will remain. But Buddhism would say that that's only true, that thinking of suffering as something that can be learned from is really probably only true for humans for the most part. Um, and I mean, maybe to some degree animals, but you also have what are called hungry ghosts, and you also have hell realm beings, and they are intensely oppressed. They're sentient beings just like us. It's a different realm of existence that consciousness can associate. That there are forms in those realms, and mind can associate with those forms, just like mind is associating with a human form right now. And the suffering that happens in those realms really doesn't serve any purpose, because there's really very little to nothing that those sentient beings can do with their suffering. They kind of just have to experience it until they die. Um, and then there are upper realms also where there's very little suffering, comparatively speaking, in terms of this level of suffering that we're talking about, like overt physical or mental distress. Animals can kind of learn to stay away from things that are hot or cold, or they can seek out food. They can do some things to ameliorate their overt distress, and we can do more of those. So for some sentient beings, there's a useful component. But Buddhism would say that if you look at reality as a whole, there are so many levels of suffering that really are pointless. Um, and so we should really try to think about suffering as something to overcome. And, while of course recognizing that, like, if you have children, or, that, like, yeah, there's still a use that, there's a useful component to it within the human realm that we're not denying. But because we're going to die, and they're, all of the humans that we're kind of seeing, recognizing that about, they're all going to die, and their mind is going to go somewhere else. um, that it's better, in a way, it's, without denying that, it's kind of better to focus more so on just thinking of suffering as something that we should just transcend completely. Um, and so then you're talking about the realm, the environment of enlightened beings. You're talking about the pure lands, the realms inhabited by fully enlightened beings who have no suffering. And I don't know, I can't, I don't know kind of how they, um, kind of what that's like. I don't know. They certainly could remember, I would assume that they have memory of what it was like to suffer. They observe the suffering of sentient beings. They understand what suffering is, but they don't actually experience it. They're not presently experiencing it. So I think perhaps still the fact that they did experience it is still relevant and useful, because they can still distinguish what is or isn't. Um, but they do abide without any suffering forever and ever, for eternity. Um, but I don't know what that's like. I don't know what that's like. Uh, yeah. Mhm. It's the wisdom realizing the nature of reality, because fundamental ignorance is a mind that concretizes reality, a mind that believes that reality is out there, separate from oneself. The wisdom that realizes that that's false is what undermines, because again, that's a non affirming negation. It simply realizes that that is mistaken without then asserting something true about perception. It simply realizes that the act of perceiving things as existing concretely, independently, as if they have their own intrinsic inherent nature and essence, separate from oneself, that that is a mistake. That's it. That's all we have to do. Once we see, and we have to do that in a really, it's easy to say intellectually, and even, in a few weeks, a few months of thinking, of reading, of meditating, it's easy to kind of get a sense of it. What's difficult, from what we have to actually have a direct, non-conceptual realization of that, which means it has to transcend concepts. It has to transcend language. We have to kind of directly see it. And that depends upon developing single pointed concentration, um, which is a level of meditative skill. If we don't develop that, then we'll never see emptiness directly. We can maybe get to like a correct inferential understanding, which is good, but we have to see it directly in order for it to actually uproot fundamental ignorance. And that depends upon single pointed concentration or calm abiding, shamatha, shine, all of the ways, talking about the same thing using different languages. Um, but we have to develop that meditative skill, and then we can, after, and really we have to calm the delusions down prior to that by doing a whole bunch of other things. We can't, the Buddha didn't just say, get single pointed concentration and meditate on emptiness. He said, get single pointed concentration and then understand, karma, and understand, you know, impermanence and death and compassion and generosity, because we have to create the inner conditions that are calm and stable enough for wisdom realizing emptiness to arise. If the mind is incredibly turbulent due to all of this pushing and pulling that we're so accustomed to, all of this kind of yo yo, up and down craziness in the mind, then we can dedicate ourselves to wisdom realizing emptiness, and we'll make progress, but we'll never see it directly until we've calmed the delusions down with all of these other things that come before or come before wisdom realizing emptiness in the Lam Rim, the stages of the path. Those create the necessary internal mental conditions for wisdom realizing emptiness to arise. Um, yeah. Okay, we are just out of time. Any final thoughts or questions? Nope. All right. So then we'll dedicate, so recollect your motivation that you established at the beginning, and think that having engaged in the class, you actualized that motivation. And doing that created positive energy in the mind. And that positive energy, when it ripens, it will ripen in a positive way. So then just think that you want it to ripen in the most positive way you can think of. So Try to imagine that it ripens in incredibly expansive, virtuous ways. Whatever you can imagine, whatever vast, broad, expansive ripening. Try to see it ripening in that way and think, when it ripens, may it ripen like that. All right. Well, thanks for coming.